Imagine if most of your work was sold without your continued consent. This is what happened to Taylor Swift's first 6 albums. And that's because, essentially, she doesn't own the master rights to any of them. So, she's re-released Fearless, the first album she co-produced, and that brought Swift her first Grammy for Album of the Year.
I think that artists deserve to own their work. I just feel very passionately about that.
But this isn't just about Taylor Swift.
They can sell them or do whatever they want to do with them, and you have no say.
The fight for owning your master recordings
When I signed, I didn't really know what was in my contract.
is as old as the music industry itself. Prince famously told Rolling Stone, "If you don't own your masters, your master owns you."
I created it, so I felt like it should belong to me. That said, the companies felt otherwise, and they would always hold this contract up and say, well, you signed it.
Black artists are also dealing with systemic racism on top of shady contracts.
I want to be able to be 100% in control over my career. I don't want to work all these nights in the studio and somebody else get to say so for how I move, when I move, or when I drop.
Today, we'll look at how artists are fighting back against a music industry that wants to own them.
Try to own as much of yourself as possible, because it's going to pay off in the long run.
Little Richard was a rock and roll pioneer and a genre bender, but even he struggled with bad contracts. These hits were released in the 1950s, but it is not clear whether Little Richard ever gained the rights to them at all. He sold the rights of Tutti Frutti to a white man named Art Rupe for $50. And while Art Rupe earned millions, Little Richard got half a cent for every copy his hit sold. Sometimes, labels even made other versions to be sung by white singers instead. Like the time when Pat Boone re-recorded Tutti Frutti for white radio audiences because Little Richard was just too radical. Years later, Little Richard told the New York Times, "I didn't read my contracts right. I signed bad contracts, and I didn't have good management or a good accountant. I was just a dumb entertainer, and I paid a big price. I paid dearly for it." But how do music copyrights actually work?
There's a musical work, which is the copyright in the song or the composition. And then there's a sound recording, which is a copyright in the recorded version of the composition. The musical work is usually owned by the songwriter and or the publisher. The sound recording is usually owned by the artist and or the record company. It's that sound recording part that's owned by the artist and or the record company, which is also referred to as the master recording.
In other words, when artists sign work for hire agreements, they give away the rights to the master recording in exchange for the money to make that recording happen. Usually, creatives get a percentage from every record that sells, but they have no control over what happens to their master.
It's very common that young, emerging, new artists enter into contracts that may not be fair to them as a result of a number of factors. Some of those deals are specifically set up so that most of the benefit is going to be with the label. They're giving away not only their copyrights, but a lot of their creative control in their music and their future music.
Like, for example, when Juicy J posted this track because he said Columbia Records wouldn't let him release his album when he wanted. Later that day, Juicy J tweeted he and Columbia Records were all good and deleted his original song. So is the music industry inherently exploitative? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some experts say that it's normal for major labels to want their money back for investing in an emerging artist.
I haven't heard many stories since the 40s and 50s of anybody holding a gun to your head. If you want to own your own masters, you must say no. And then you need to find the financing and the marketing and the promotion to be independent and release your own record. But you can't have it both ways, in my opinion.
Others say there are plenty of ways to get a fairer deal.
There's still this sort of fairy tale mentality for some independent artists to sign a record deal and then become the next big star that they look up to. They chase that a lot to the point where they may overlook even opportunities with smaller labels that may have fairer or more artist-friendly deals.
The music industry also doesn't treat everyone the same.
There's a mountain, and it's mighty high.
Prince equated the system of corporate contracts to slavery by scribbling "slave" on his face during a performance. He set the groundwork for others, like Pharrell Williams and Kanye West, to pull back the curtains on how the music industry exploits Black artists.
Many of the artists today are artists of color. They're very young, many of them fresh out of high school, if not still in high school. They come from impoverished backgrounds. I don't believe there's an equal playing field in light of systemic racism.
Take, for example, Megan Thee Stallion.
Real hot girl.
Before Megan Thee Stallion was a Grammy-winning celebrity rapper, she was a full-time college student in Houston. She signed with her record label 1501 in her early 20s, and 2 years later, she sued them after she said they took advantage of her and threatened to block her from releasing new music. 1501's CEO Carl Crawford denied these claims.
All I did was ask to renegotiate my contract. Then it became a big old thing. When I signed, I didn't really know what was in my contract. I was young, I think I was like 20.
In the past years, artists of color have been topping the Billboard charts. In 2018 alone, over half of all artists on the Hot 100 year-end chart were people of color. And women of color made up over 70% of all female performers. But the chances of most of them owning their masters are slim. Artists like Rihanna, Jay-Z, Frank Ocean, and Chance the Rapper own their masters. But others don't, like Juicy J or even Drake, who reportedly doesn't own his pre-2018 catalog.
I don't think that there's as much overt racism in the music industry as there was in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and 80s, but there's still a systemic racism when you look at how deals are structured.
Artists' social media give us a glimpse of what's happening in the music industry, who gets exploited and by whom. The exposure of potentially exploitative contracts has led some musicians to push back. Ray Charles was not only among the earliest Black artists to merge blues with gospel, but also one of the first to own his masters. Prince fought with music labels to have full control over his music, and won.
I don't believe in contracts, but I did my own agreement without the help of a lawyer.
Then there's also the power structure. While artists of color are leading the charts, they're not leading executive boards. Most of the music that's produced and played is actually run by these 14 people. 11 of them are white men. But just because you have more POC or Black entrepreneurs and executives doesn't guarantee that things will change. Remember, they'll still be working in an inherently exploitative system that's rooted in a profit over everything ideology. In other words, capitalism. So the fear of being trapped by a label might be why so many artists are choosing to go independent. And that's the fastest growing segment of the global recorded music industry today. Charlie Wilson, Ledisi, Anthony Hamilton, these artists all left their labels in recent years.
So it doesn't mean that you need to give up all your rights right now just because you had one song that did well on TikTok. It doesn't mean you go and sign a publishing deal and go and sign a record deal and say, okay, for all your next several songs, you're giving away the copyrights for them.
There is something else that artists can do. They can join unions. That's right, there are music unions in the United States. And if you haven't heard of them, that's okay, because some artists haven't either.
We don't have a union as artists. We're just fighting for ourselves.
Any artist who signs with Universal, Sony, or Warner Music Group is eligible for SAG-AFTRA membership. It's a union that represents around 160,000 professionals, like TV actors and models, but only 5,000 of them are vocalists. Then there's the American Federation of Musicians that represents around 80,000 instrumentalists. So how much can these unions protect artists from unfair deals?
Most artists are on their own when it comes to the agreements that they enter into, unless it is some sort of a union-controlled job. So let's say if it's a movie set or if it's a concert hall.
So it's no wonder that after weeks of global Black Lives Matter protests, music executives said the show must be paused. Jamila Thomas and Brianna Agyeman called for a blackout day for music industries to reflect on their role in systemic racism and commit to doing better. Warner, Sony, and Universal, the three major record labels, all said that they stand with the Black community and promise to donate millions to social justice causes. But they never addressed the inequalities present in their own companies, like the lack of top representation or contracts with exploitative terms. In the end, the music business is deeply rooted in the US capitalist system, where to get ahead, artists sign attractive deals, often at the expense of their own rights.
I would challenge all artists before they get into these agreements to sit down and actually ask that every one of these things be explained to them, like free goods clauses and digital rights and ownership of masters.
And only very few, like Taylor Swift, can afford to fight for it.
You protect your home, you protect your car. Many people protect their laptop more than they protect their intellectual property rights, the rights in their songs, the rights in their masters. So my advice would be to take it seriously. Recognize that those songs and those master recordings are assets that you need to protect at all costs.